And to Talia, who's not here this morning, she's not running at full speed, but she's watching us. And thanks so much to Talia for all that she does as our program director and advertising, recruiting speakers. I'm leaving a lot of it out. And Evan, thank you, Evan. Couldn't do it without you. And I'm even going to thank Dwight. Thanks, Dwight. A reminder that Yair Luria is going to be doing a presentation about his cooking with his cookbook. This is June 28th in the afternoon from 1 to 3. And if you're interested, be sure to RSV because we're hoping for a lot of people in attendance. And yes, good food.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
He's just going to talk food.
Dwight seems to be registering a protest here. So we have a library contact list if you want to be sure and be notified by email if you feel you haven't been receiving notifications. I've got a clipboard here with the contact list on it. And be sure to RSVP to that presentation. And then many thanks to Team Weisberg and Oslick for doing these wonderful, wonderful presentations. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Am I on? Am I being heard? Testing. There we are. All right. A very good morning, everyone. Oh, and yeah. It's nice to be back at it.
You want to put the light down?
Yeah, let's put the light down so you guys can see the screen a little more clearly. So this is a tricky topic that I've wanted to talk about for a while now. When I was in graduate school getting my master's in history, I signed up for a class on gender and sexuality in the Islamic Middle East. And it was a fascinating class. The first class I'd ever taken that had looked seriously and closely at this other Abrahamic religion. I went to a Catholic high school. I took religion classes all 4 years. I feel like I know a fair bit about Christianity. While I knew the basics about Islam, I'd never studied it closely. And this talk today draws on some of the things that I learned while in this class. It also, it also touches on the similarities and differences between Judaism and Islam. We are, in some ways, very different religions, but we're also, in some ways, very similar ones. We're both from the Middle East. We're both religions of Semitic peoples. We draw on a lot of the same pre-Abrahamic culture that you don't really see in Christianity, which is primarily a European religion. We have similar ideas about the importance of dietary rules, about covering your head, about praying in the direction of your holy city. So what we're gonna cover today, in particular, is we're gonna talk about the subject of women, which is can be a fiery topic in Judaism and in Islam, and indeed in any religion or culture. But I wanted to draw a comparison between how women are treated in Judaism and how women are treated in Islam. Acknowledge, look at some similarities, acknowledge some differences, and ask why. But I thought let's start by talking about a couple of the more extreme cases coming out of the Islamic world. Because really, while we're talking about Judaism and Islam today, I assume most of my audience are familiar with Judaism and Jewish law and the state of women in Judaism. So we're going to talk a lot about Islam. Who here has heard about the Mecca schoolgirls fire from Saudi Arabia? What do you remember about that, Simone?
That the girls were not allowed to leave the premises because they were not covered or properly dressed.
Correct. Yes. You can see in this picture here, this is a girls' school in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and as Simone pointed out, these girls tried to evacuate. Their building was on fire, and members of the religious police forced them back into the building because they were not wearing the veil, they were not properly covered, and they didn't want them to be out present around men who were not relatives or their husbands, unless they were veiled, and 15 of them died in the fire, in part as a result of this. Has anyone heard of the case of Zafran Bibi in Pakistan? So Zafran Bibi went to the police and reported that she'd been raped by her brother-in-law. There was an investigation of her brother-in-law. Despite considerable evidence, including forensic evidence of his guilt, the case was dismissed, at which point she was then charged with fornication and told that she had confessed to fornication when she came in and made this accusation. Because she was pregnant, this was used as evidence that she had engaged in fornication, and she was declared to be guilty and was sentenced to death. She wasn't actually put to death, but she was sentenced to death. And has anyone heard of the case of Bari Magaza in Nigeria? Bari Magaza accused three separate men of having raped her. The men were not her accusations against the men were not investigated. However, her accusation and the fact that she was pregnant were used as evidence that she engaged in fornication, and she was sentenced to 100 lashes for fornication and an additional 80 lashes for making a false accusation of fornication against those three men. I have any of you guys, this is a bit more recent. A woman, not her real name, her name was kept private. This was a big issue in India. This woman named Samira, has anyone heard of this one? She had tuberculosis. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Her husband did not want to have to support her through the medical bills and all the issues with that, and so he divorced her over WhatsApp, using a triple divorce, a kind of legal formula where he divorced her 3 times by saying divorced 3 times, meaning that he could not be forced to take her back and made responsible again for her medical bills. Yes, please.
The other few mentioned, Bibi and Magaza, were either of them married or not?
Neither of these, so Dwight was just asking, in either of these cases, Bibi or Magaza, was either of these women married? And the answer is no. Neither of these women were married, so they weren't being charged with adultery. In these cases, they were being charged with fornication.
The death penalty for fornication?
Death penalty for fornication, and we will talk about that. I could keep going. There are cases where the crime is adultery. There are a number of cases simply, not of the women being punished for making the accusation, but simply nothing being done about it. These are the result. These are all cases where the women in question were interacting with legal systems that were applying Islamic law in the late 20th or early 21st century. In the case of India, Muslim communities in India still they still have an independent system of Islamic courts, of religious courts, for handling things like marriage and divorce and cases like that. So we keep going. So the question becomes, what's happening here? Why are we seeing these extreme cases? And obviously these are extreme cases. This doesn't happen to all Muslim women, but clearly there's a pattern here and there's an issue. Any theories, guys? What are we seeing here? Why are there these sorts of extreme cases? Yeah, Simone.
The women have no rights.
Because the women have no rights. Anyone else have a theory? Yes.
Well, are any of these communities feel under threat that their norms are being challenged and that they have to take extreme positions?
You're suggesting some of these communities might feel under threat, like their traditions are being challenged, and so this is a way of pushing back on them. I want you to remember that, keep a pin in that, because that's a good theory. Anyone else got an explanation for this?
Deterrence against, so other women are just scared.
deterrence, Janice says, deterrence to keep other women afraid, so they're afraid to speak up. I'm sure that's also part of it. Anyone else? Yes, Dwight.
I would just suggest that the cases you mentioned might have been a particularly corrupt system, bribery.
Particularly corrupt system involving bribery. So an interesting case, one of the cases I did not list up here was the case of a young woman who was the daughter of a high-ranking politician in Pakistan. And a group of men broke into their house and they raped her. And it was a very egregious case. And even though her father was a very powerful figure, was a minister in the Pakistani government, he still wasn't able to make anything happen. She didn't face any charges, but nothing was done, despite her identifying the men involved. They were all found to be innocent. So you would think in a system dictated by, say, bribery and corruption, you would expect a case like that not to happen. You would expect the wealthy and powerful, at least, to be able to make sure that men who assault, say, their wives and daughters are punished, even if the poor aren't. So it's not just, well, there may be questions of corruption in some of these systems. That doesn't seem to be what's going on here. That doesn't seem to be the major issue. Yes? Jonathan mentions a tug and pull. Sorry, I'm talking for the benefit of people online.
That's good.
There we are.
Oh, what do you know? Okay, does this work? Hello? Okay, great. So there's a tug and pull throughout the Islamic world on modernity. And the cases that you mentioned, so Nigeria has this issue with Boko Haram. Obviously, we know what's going on in Iran. Saudi Arabia is going through metamorphosis. When this tension tilts toward the, let's say, the more extremist view of religion, the first rights to go are women. And I don't know enough about these specific cases to connect the dots, but my guess is in each case, there is some kind of political pull that has to do with people in power needing to demonstrate that they are, I don't know exactly the word, pure, pious, or or fervent relative to the faith, and that manifests itself in terms of the treatment of women.
I like this. No, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. And I also want us to keep that in mind, because we are going to come back to those kind of ideas and what is motivating these politicians. So, one thing no one has brought up with is the theory that is Islamic law simply harsher towards women than Jewish law? Is that a possible explanation here? And that's going to be our essential question as we go through this. I'm gonna ask, is Islamic law is there something inherent to it that makes it worse for women than Jewish law? And if this is the case, why? I'm assuming you guys are broadly familiar with Jewish law, so we're going to mostly talk about Islam. And we're going to start by talking about pre-modern Islamic law towards women and how it was administered. And we can compare this to traditional Jewish law starting there, and then see what this looks like, translated into the present day. Do you guys follow what we're doing? And then we will come back to some of those other motivations, some of those other explanations at the end. Yes, Dwight, sir. Mr. Freund.
That's on. That statement suggests that there's something called modern Islamic law. Is that the case?
So, yeah, there is. No legal system is static, right? No legal system is completely static over time. It's always going to change in response to new demands. There's new questions that laws need to answer. There's new interactions with other cultures. It would be, in theory, for instance, there's one Jewish law, absolute and unchanging. But I feel like Jewish law, as we follow it here at Mosaic Law, or as it's followed over at Knesset Israel, or even over at places like Chabad, is going to look rather different from how Jewish law was followed in, say, the Kingdom of Judea, when it was a Roman client state, versus ancient Israel. This is prior to the Talmud. And so Islamic law has not been static. We're going to look at the roots. In particular, we're going to look at Islamic law in, say, the late medieval, early modern period, when we have the best records of it. And we're going to talk about it there. Yeah, Janice.
Yeah, from my minimal knowledge of anything related to this, minimal.
Sure.
I think there's some kind of a concept in Islamic law that if a man wants to be with a woman, he can declare that it's a temporary marriage, that it's a short temporary marriage thing, like if he's traveling in another city and he has a fling, oh, that's a short temporary marriage. And so he might be able to even interpret his taking a woman against her will within that context as well. I'm not sure.
This is, I was wondering if someone would bring this up. I didn't really work it in because, as I will mention later in the talk, we're kind of jumping around here, but that's fine. We're mostly going to focus, really just only going to focus on Sunni Islam. Because Islam is so broad. It's such a big religion in so many different places, and there's so much diversity of thought. So I wasn't really going to talk about Shia Islam. What you're bringing up, temporary marriages, is only a thing in Shia Islam. It's not a thing in Sunni Islam, and the Sunni commentators all make fun of Shia for doing this temporary marriage thing. My understanding of the temporary marriages, which we covered very briefly in this class I took, is that it was a way for Shia judges, for the Shia legal system, to avoid punishing men for hiring prostitutes. Their reasoning was that fornication is a capital crime. You want to avoid that, and so if you let a man and a woman have a temporary marriage, usually these would last for a few days, even if the marriage is purely contracted for the purpose of the man paying the woman a sum of money in exchange for her agreeing to be intimate with him, that this was a lesser evil than the man paying her and engaging in fornication with her through sex work. And that was the thinking behind it, and that was the intention of it, and it was a way to try and do that. It is only a thing in Shia Islam, it was controversial even there. But that is a thing within some areas. Yes. Anyway, I wanted to cover a couple. We'll get there. I promise. You'll have lots of opportunities. Anyway, just want to cover a couple of terms as we dive in. A dower is a term referring to a bride price paid by a prospective husband to a wife or to her family. We still use dowers today. It's part of Jewish law and Jewish marriage, and today they look like this. This is why the expectation is that the Jewish groom is the one who pays for the rings. Sarah's holding up her ring over there. This is also why.
No stone, because you can tell the value of it.
Yes. Yep, because the value of a gemstone is hard to assess, but if it's just a plain gold or silver band, then you just weigh it and you say, all right, that's what it's worth. And then you know that it's sufficient to meet the minimum amount you need for a dower. It's somewhat vestigial of a practice today, but it was a bigger deal back then. And then because we are getting into some adult topics today in this lecture, fornication refers to any sex, whether consensual or not, between unmarried individuals. And adultery, any sex between a married individual and someone who they are not married to. Any questions about this terminology here? Okay. And hey guys, feel free, if I use any words or anything like that you aren't following or that feels confusing, don't hesitate to raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you and clarify. All right. So let's start in the beginning. Before Abraham, before Judaism or Islam, there is a common legal culture across the pre-Abrahamic Middle East. It's got its roots in Mesopotamia, in Sumeria, in the culture in the region that had the first written legal codes, and so their systems of law tended to influence the rest of the region considerably. And we have a number of those surviving early legal codes. You guys have heard of the Code of Hammurabi, for instance, and we have some surviving marriage contracts in Mesopotamia and Sumeria. Those were made in clay, which was then fired. So we have a number of marriage contracts. And what we see is that marriage in the pre-Abrahamic Middle East was very much about economics. It was an economic agreement. You paid a dower, often a substantial one. The wife often brought a dowry with her into the marriage, so it was sort of a combining of resources, or even an exchange of them. Main interests are survival. You are pooling resources. You are forming connections between families. There's also, as Sarah reminded me when I was putting this together, there's also a lot of laws centered around ensuring paternity. All these rules about fornication and adultery that fall most heavily on women seem to be mostly based around men trying to guarantee that any children they have with that woman are their children. Let's see. Female sexual capacity was seen as the property of either her father or her husband. As a result, fornication or adultery was a property crime against him. It was not seen as a crime against the woman because she didn't own what was being violated. And as a result, volition was of secondary importance and sometimes doesn't matter at all. If a young woman is sleeping with her boyfriend, who she's not married to, it's a property crime against her father, just as surely as if it's the result of sexual assault and coercion. And so volition doesn't really matter. It shows up a little bit when it comes to wives and betrothed women with the idea that they shouldn't be punished. Only the man who's committed this property crime should be punished. But otherwise, it doesn't really appear. This is where you see laws requiring, for instance, if a man has slept with a woman and they weren't married, that he has to marry her now, because there's a fear there about what you might call ruination, the idea that now that she's had sex, no one will want to marry her, and she won't be able to command a high dower, and so the requirement is this guy has to pay a high dower and has to marry her as a way of ensuring that she gets to marry someone and that she's taken care of, which seems very strange to our modern sentiment. This is the criticism where people are like, well, the Bible requires that that a woman marry her rapist. These kind of laws exist more with the idea that this might be, say, a boyfriend or like a secret boyfriend she has, or things like that. What is noticeable is that religious themes are totally absent in these laws. While there is a little bit of involvement of gods being invoked when you sign a marriage contract, there is no idea that marriage is like in obedience to any particular divine instruction, or that divorce goes against any divine instruction. There's no real involvement of religion here. These are economic agreements. Marriage is an economic agreement, and rules about sex they're about ensuring paternity. That's what it comes down to. There really isn't much of a moral theme here. There is a tradition of modesty. You'll notice this woman right here, she's covering her hair. That is an old one. The idea of women and men covering their heads or covering certain parts of their body in the name of modesty predates Abrahamic religion and is very old in the Middle East. And this is sort of the common roots of both Jewish law and Islamic law that you see elements of later reflected. Are there any questions? I see some hands. Why don't we get Jonathan and then you?
Thank you, Nathan. Are there patterns that follow these that are parallel in other parts of the world at the same time? Europe, Americas, East Asia, that type of thing?
Yes. Yes and no. There is a common concern with paternity in any patriarchal culture. Any culture you have where men show dominance, there is a concern of men of making sure that any children they have are their children and not someone else's, and so you have rules punishing women for exercising sexual capacity outside of marriage. But it's different. It's different in different places. In Scandinavia, pre-modern Scandinavia, there was this sort of just assumption that when men went away raiding and would be away for months, that women might have guys they were involved with, and any children they had, those children belonged to the husband when he came back, and this was seen as privileging the husband. that he got these extra children to have, regardless of whether they were his genetic descendants, and sort of a punishment to the wife's boyfriend, whoever he was, he doesn't get to be part of his kid's life. And that is very different from this sort of an approach. So you do see similarities in some places. It's not universal. And there are also questions of degree. You had a question.
Yeah, this is about ruination. It's always puzzled me that Dinah just seems to disappear altogether from the Bible. Is she ruined? Is that what happened?
That's it's always puzzled me that as well. We don't hear about her before the incident, and then where she's taken away like that, and then those guys are massacred, and then we don't hear about her afterwards. I don't know. What I can tell you is that there was a common practice in not just the ancient Near East, but also the Mediterranean world, of men who wanted to marry a woman, and maybe her parents said no, or you didn't think they were going to give you permission, kidnapping that woman and running away with her and being intimate with her. And this is actually what the word rapine originally means in Latin, from which we get the modern idea of rape. But originally, it didn't necessarily imply that it was involuntary on her part. It could simply be she and her boyfriend are running away. They're basically eloping to get married, and they're presenting her parents with a fait accompli. Now you have to let us get married because no one else will want to marry her. Trying to use these rules about ruination and stuff like that to their advantage. And it's possible, I think, to read the story of Dinah to some degree in that way, because when those guys, Shechem is the town, right? When the guy in Shechem, and when he's told, well, you need to be circumcised if you want to do this properly, he says yes. Clearly, she matters to him beyond merely a passing desire. Clearly, he wants to actually marry her, and so it's a difficult. I'm not a rabbi, and that is one of those stories in the Torah that I have long struggled with. That's kind of tricky to understand and to interpret. Anyway, if there are no other questions, all right, let's keep going then. And then I just wanted to briefly summarize Jewish law on these topics, which again, I assume you guys are fairly familiar with. With the introduction of Jewish law, marriage remains in part a commercial transaction. Remember, you're paying a dower if you're the husband, but marriage and divorce take on a religious aspect that they did not have in Sumeria or Babylonia or in Hittite or Assyrian law. There's this idea that God commands us to get married, and that by being married you are doing a righteous act, you are doing what God wants, that this is something sacred, that this is something holy. The Babylonian practice of sacred prostitution totally disappears. There's no equivalent, nothing even remotely similar in Judaism. And a woman's volition becomes an issue, because there's this idea that women as well as men have individual relationships with God, which means their actions, their volition, their willingness or lack thereof is suddenly important in a way it never was before in determining whether or not her actions are sinful or righteous or things like that. This is sort of a start in moving towards a lot of our modern attitudes towards sexuality and towards volition and things like that kind of begin in Jewish law, and this idea that I'm forgetting the word. This idea that everyone has a moral relationship with the divine, and that this dictates all our actions. Fornication and adultery are capital crimes, but only for the woman if she acted willingly. There are rules laying that out. Her property becomes her husband's in marriage, except her ketubah. But she has rights to food, clothing, and conjugal attention from her husband, and he's not allowed to take a second wife or more than one unless he can guarantee that both wives will receive these equally. The Talmud expands on women's rights. It gives women greater rights to own property or to manage property within a marriage. It greatly restricts the ability of men to take second wives. It basically says you can't really You can't practically have a second wife and actually treat everyone equally. And so there's a shift away from that. And it also obsoletes the death penalty. Now, they do this for all the death penalty crimes, not just the ones involving fornication and adultery. And they're not doing it because they approve of, say, fornication or adultery. They're doing it because they don't want to put people to death. They say in order to convict someone of fornication or adultery, you need 2 male witnesses. They have to see you before you commit the crime. They have to tell you this is against the law. You'll be put to death if you do this. The person has to answer affirmatively that they're aware that this is a capital crime and that they're doing it anyway. And then the 2 witnesses have to see them do the act. And the result is, and they're doing this deliberately to make it impossible. And it's not clear exactly how Jewish courts would have handled these things if they're not sentencing people to death, but because clearly they're not approving of these actions, but they're taking steps to try and, as I said, obsolete the death penalty. Right. Any other questions or comments on this, guys? Yeah. Cantor.
I was actually thinking about the mention of the conjugal attention in Jewish law, because it's actually required of a man who has been married for the first year. He is not allowed to go to war. He's not allowed to be away from his wife. So that he makes her happy for at least that first year. Is there anything in Sunni law that is similar?
No. This is one of the major differences between Jewish law and Islamic law, is that women in Islamic law do not have a right to conjugal attention. They also don't have a right to say no to conjugal attention. That's one area where I think we have an advantage over it, and to the point that we covered this in the class I took, to the point where it's been an issue like in the modern day. In Saudi Arabia, there have been women appealing to the legal system in that country, saying, my husband has not been intimate with me for years. Do I have a right to seek a divorce? And the religious judges, the Islamic judges, saying, no, you don't. You don't have a right to demand conjugal attention. They do have a right to support, to food, clothing, and shelter from their husband. But there is no equivalent right to conjugal attention like there is in Judaism. The husband, though, does have a right to demand it from the wife. And there are long lists of things he's allowed to do if she doesn't want to give it to him, beginning with him sort of like refusing to kind of like giving her the silent treatment, and continuing on to him cutting off food and clothing and shelter. And yeah. But we're speaking medievally. Was there someone else who had a hand? Okay, let's keep going. All right. So let's start. Let's get into Islamic law and actually talk about it proper. Unsurprisingly, it is one of the big things you got to acknowledge first before we go into Islamic law is just the sheer size and diversity. There's about 2 billion Muslims in the world today and about 15-16 million Jews. There's a lot more of them than there are of us. There have been for a very long time. They're spread across a very large geographic area, as you can see in that map up there. And so the result is there's considerable diversity in how different Muslim communities in different places understand their own religious law and follow it, even if they're operating off of the same holy text. Differences do creep in there. Generally, Islamic law is grouped into 4 major schools and a whole bunch of minor ones. And these different schools of jurisprudence, you can think of them as a little like Talmud Bavli versus Talmud Yerushalmi, or a little like how we have Ashkenazi interpretations of the law and minhag versus, say, Sephardi or Mizrahi or Beit Yisrael interpretations of the law. But this isn't an exact analogy, and you shouldn't take it too far. These schools of jurisprudence are basically different schools of thought for how to interpret Islamic law as laid down in the Quran. They have the same Quran, all of them, their holy text. They don't all have the same hadiths. Does anyone know what the hadiths are? We don't have an equivalent of the hadiths in Judaism. Closest to the hadiths would be like midrash. Does anyone know what hadiths are?
Well, there are traditions about what of what Muhammad and his earliest followers said and did.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Apparently, a few decades after the death of Muhammad, there were people telling all kinds of stories of, they remember he said this or he did this, and people were saying, well, some of these stories going around aren't true, and so there was a concerted effort to try and write down this record of things he might have said or done that don't appear in the Quran and keep records of them. And there is no universal agreement as to which hadiths are true and which ones aren't true. And which hadiths are accepted as valid or not depend on which of those four schools of Islamic jurisprudence you subscribe to. Some of them value, say some are true, some say others aren't. Have any of you guys heard of the 70 virgins thing? The belief among some radical Islamic groups that if you die on jihad, you get 70 virgins in the afterlife. That is from a hadith. It does not appear in the Quran, and it's from a very obscure hadith whose sourcing is held in suspect by most of the major schools in Islam. It is taking it as seriously as they take it and making as big a deal out of it as they take it is very much a modern thing. Of those four schools, we're mostly going to talk about two of them today. Much as I'd love to go into detail about others, there's just so much we could talk about. The first is the Hanafi school, and that is the school in light green up there on the map. And that was the official school of jurisprudence of the Ottoman Empire. That's one reason why it's as important as it is. And the other is the Maliki school, which is the big one in North Africa and West Africa. And that's the one it's in sort of like a turquoise light blue up there. But as you can see from the other colors elsewhere on the map, there's others as well we could talk about. Another aspect of Islamic law that makes it very different from Jewish law is the involvement of the state. From the annexation of the Kingdom of Judea by the Roman Empire, we haven't had, up until the founding of the State of Israel, we haven't had any Jewish governments applying Jewish law as like state law being applied by the state. Jewish law as it existed for most of the past 2,000 years was in the form of customary law. Jewish communities applying Jewish law, following it on a voluntary basis because they wanted to. You might have the force of like community, threat of being ostracized if you don't follow it, but you don't have like a complex criminal justice system. You have Jewish communities forming Beit Din, forming informal religious courts, applying this, but you don't have systems of like prisons. You don't really have capital punishment. You don't have of things like that. Whereas with Islam, you have governments. From the conversion of the city of Medina, Muhammad is leading an Islamic state in Arabia, one that comes to embrace the whole of Arabia by the time he dies, and within a century of his death has swept across the entire Middle East. And so a lot of the issues involved in government law that don't appear in customary law show up in Islamic law. Stuff like having a ruling class, the interests of the monarch, the interests of the nobility, the interests of powerful people versus those who aren't powerful. You don't see quite so much when you're looking at a law administered by a community purely on its own members. Questions of property ownership and inheritance and waging war and things that were fairly academic for Jews for 2,000 years have remained a very big deal in Islam. One very minor example is, you guys know one of the most commonly used symbols for the Islamic faith today is the crescent and the star. And that's actually a pre-Islamic symbol. It predates Islam. Because versions of the crescent and star have been used in the Middle East for a very long time. It was a widely used symbol by the Persian Empire when it was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate. And they use it to a degree. It doesn't get associated with Islam as an Islamic symbol until the Ottoman Empire. makes it their flag and requires every mosque in the Ottoman Empire to fly this flag with the crescent and star on it. And after a century or so of doing that, people just start associating it with Islam. And you will find Muslims today who will tell you, no, that's a Turkish symbol, and that they reject it being used as the equivalent of, like, you know, the Jewish star or the cross in Christianity. Right. I wanted to just note a couple other sources for Islamic law. One is Sunnah. And Sunnah is functionally the Muslim version of minhag. It's the idea that in different places in the world, you're going to have different sets of tradition that have acquired the binding force of law over generations, and that these need to be taken into account when making legal judgments. And so there's a different sunnah in, like, Indonesia versus in West Africa versus in Arabia, and that shapes how their law is understood and applied. And then there's consensus, the idea that if everyone in the Muslim world more or less agrees that something is the law, it's treated as the law. And probably the most obvious example of that is the veil. Nowhere in the Quran does it require women to wear a veil. Nowhere in the Hadiths does it require women to wear a veil. Muhammad recommends it. In one specific incident in a city in Arabia, he says that morally upright women should wear the veil so people can tell the difference between women who are morally upright. Men can tell the difference between women who are morally upright and women who aren't. But he doesn't say it as a command. He says you should consider doing this. It's phrased as an idea, but it's been treated as a law in the Islamic world. Under the Ottoman Empire, Muslim women who didn't wear the veil faced penalties, often corporal punishment. And this sort of thing is very widespread and acquired some consensus, although less so these days. You'll notice that Muslim women in America commonly cover their hair, but commonly don't wear a veil. All right. And then, of course, there's the question of the different schools of jurisprudence and how you understand and apply these laws. Are there any questions about this, guys? No? I was struck learning about this. Well, it is different from Jewish law in a lot of ways. I was struck in some ways by the similarities, in terms of having legal commentators, and then building on the comments made by those legal commentators by other legal commentators. And there's a lot of the just sort of general approach of saying, well, it says this in the Quran, but we really don't want to do that. So we're going to interpret the law in such a way that we don't really have to do that, and we can address the issue in a different way. And it does remind me a bit of some of how we do things.
One question.
Yes.
How do the schools align with Sunni versus Shia? Is there a...
The Shia have their own. The Shia have their own school of jurisprudence. Technically, they have two. Do you see the sort of orange color up there on the map that overlaps with Azerbaijan, Iran, and part of Iraq? That is the main school of Shia jurisprudence. And then there's this much smaller secondary one. You see it up there in yellow in Central Asia. That is its own thing. But the Shia have their own school of jurisprudence. The Abadi, which is another movement within Islam, which really only exists in the Sultanate of Oman. You can see it, it's kind of, it's like pink down there at the bottom of Arabia. That's its own school of jurisprudence. The four major schools I'm talking about, those are a thing in Sunni Islam. They are not a thing in Shia or in any of the other smaller groups. All right. Addressing this one. So there's a series of laws in the Quran called hudud laws, and they are the handful of death penalty laws that Islam lays out in its scripture. And they include things like piracy and banditry, and they also include zina, which is an Arabic word that covers fornication and adultery and several other different types of impermissible sexual relations. And also because you don't want people accusing people of a capital crime right and left, making a false accusation of this is also a capital crime. Are you guys drawing some connections here between this and some of those extreme instances we were talking about earlier on? And right. All of the major schools in Islam do essentially the same thing the rabbis in the Talmud did, which is they move to reduce capital punishment. And they do it by saying to sentence anyone to death for a hudud violation, you need 4 adult male Muslim witnesses who aren't related to each other or to anyone involved in the thing, and they have to have all seen the act occur, and they also have to be upstanding, respected figures in their community, and they give a whole long list of ways in which they have to be respected, including the one that always stuck out to me was they can't be backgammon players. Backgammon players aren't, they can't testify in capital cases. It's not, and the different schools have different standards for these witnesses. And they're not doing this because they approve of fornication, of zina, or of false accusations of zina. They're doing this because they don't want to be sentencing people to death. In the Hanafi school, yes, we have a question.
That raises a question both for the Jewish 2 witnesses and the Islamic 4 witnesses, and that is that is there an alternative penalty? In other words, because it's often reported, particularly, let's say recently, I've seen it reported as 4 witnesses that make it look like, well, you can't convict someone
Yes.
of rape because. And you mentioned the case with 2 individuals, but can they be
I cited 2
convicted?
specific cases of that, yeah.
They can, if you can't convict them of rape, then can you punish them under some other?
Yes.
Or do you go away? In other words, let me phrase it more generally. If you're trying to get rid of the death penalty, and so which is how you describe these modifications, then is the alternative that people who commit particularly gross crimes, which seem to require the death penalty, but you remove the death penalty, so they go free.
So that is, what you're landing on is a big part of the issue with how Islamic law is applied in the modern day, because, as I'm going to get into on this slide, the medieval Muslim judges, the medieval Muslim legal system, that's what they did. They found lesser ways to punish people. The Hanafi approach is effectively to make conviction for zina of any kind, including rape, impossible, unless the person actually goes into court and confesses. A woman turning up pregnant outside of marriage is not considered a confession. That would not be sufficient evidence to convict her of zina. So you just can't convict someone. This does mean they don't have a lot of good ways to punish men who engage in rape. What they usually do is they find lesser crimes. They say, we can't convict you of assaulting this woman, but we know that the 2 of you were physically present in a room alone together, and this is improper conduct, this is public indecency, and then they would punish the husband for some crime, not husband, the rapist, for something like public indecency. That's one way to do it. The Maliki approach is to go back to pre-Abrahamic law, which treated rape as a property crime, and to say this is a property crime. Theft can be, you don't need 4 adult, male, Muslim, unrelated witnesses who don't play backgammon to convict someone of theft. You can use women as witnesses, you can use non-Muslims as witnesses, you can use children as witnesses, you can bring in other evidence other than 4 witnesses and use that to prove the crime, and the penalty for that usually in the Maliki school was 30 to 50 lashes for the man. The one difference between the Hanafi and the Maliki is the Maliki treated a woman getting pregnant outside of marriage as evidence of evidence that she was engaging in fornication. However, if she went to a religious court and testified and said, I was raped, the Maliki legal manuals instruct the judges. They say, even when you're virtually certain that this woman is lying and is just saying this because she wants to get away with her relationship with her boyfriend, you treat it as introducing enough reasonable doubt into the case to take the death penalty off the table. And so you have cases. When I was in this class, we studied. We have the best records from the Islamic legal system. There's some very good early modern court records from the Islamic legal system under the Hanafi court. And there's these cases of, like, this woman comes to a court and confesses. In the court, she says, "Yeah, I engaged in zina, and I'm confessing because I want to be honest, and I'm sorry I did it." And why is she coming to a court and confessing to a capital crime? Well, the judge doesn't sentence her to death. He basically says, "Don't do it again," and records that she's done this thing and then lets her go and doesn't do anything else. And why is she there? Well, it may be because she's afraid she's going to end up pregnant and she would rather get ahead of the thing. It may be because she's afraid of an honor killing and she wants the court to know if something happens to her, where to look. That this, to look at her male relatives, and she's looking for a way to constrain them by involving the state in this case. But the reality is, despite these things technically being capital crimes that should be punished with stoning, they almost never were. And the actual Islamic approach to these things in the Middle Ages and in the pre-modern period, early modern period, was a very organic, very messy kind of approach, one rooted in the communities that were making these rulings and looking at these laws. Certainly, a medieval Muslim court would not have, in the cases of those women we talked about earlier, would definitely not have punished either of those women for making accusations of rape, and probably would have punished the men that they identified. They wouldn't have sentenced them to death, but it would have found ways to punish them. Especially if they'd been accused of similar things in the past, especially if they were seen as if they had a reputation, then they likely would have done something. Any other questions about this, guys? I know this is all kind of, this can be kind of adult and it gets a little bit dark, but the reality is that medieval law is often a lot more liberal than people in the 21st century give it credit for. The actual written legal codes frequently seem very harsh, but the way they're applied is rarely all that harsh because they just don't have the state capacity, right? These governments don't have the ability to actually apply these laws universally in the same way in all these cases. And so there's a lot of judges just making their own judgment based on trying to keep everyone happy. Yes?
So, in practical terms, in the age of empire, I mean, we know this, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire, where you have your sultan, who's in Constantinople, but then it's separated into the vilayets and the sanjaks and all these kind of district authorities, and then it kind of goes down to a tribe. So you have what you're explaining is your religious courts that are applying,
which are also your civil courts. These aren't there's no distinction. In the Ottoman Empire, you got one Muslim legal system, and Jews and Christians might have their own. We might form our own Beit Din. The Jews of Baghdad would handle that stuff themselves. But
although we also know in the Ottoman Empire that it depends on what period in the Ottoman Empire, because
That's
in the
true.
latter Ottoman Empire it becomes much more Islamic as compared to earlier, where it's more multi-dimensional. Anyway. Is there, from what you're explaining, from the kind of the theory to the practice, is there a difference? Meaning that the courts might say one thing, which is what you're explaining here, but when it comes, so the woman returns to her family and her village and whatever, and is there a sense also that there could be some tribal justice, which is different from what the courts say that the administrative authorities just simply overlook?
Yes, 100%. So the court we looked into, I can lend you the book if you ever want to borrow it, is looking at all these cases specifically from a single Ottoman court in the city of Aintab, Syria. So this is this isn't part of Turkey. This is a conquered area. It's been conquered at this point for about 2 generations, and this new judge is taking office. And him taking office is in part, Constantinople, Istanbul, trying to extend more control over this part of Syria. And one of the things that comes through very clearly looking at these cases from this sort of case study that we studied is that, one, all these communities have alternative sources of justice. They are coming to this imperial court voluntarily because they want to involve the state court for whatever reason. Often it's because they want a more neutral court to hear out cases. It's kind of hard for a community to pass judgments where everyone knows everyone else and no one is truly neutral, no one is truly non-biased. And the idea of, all right, we'll go ask the judge in Aintab who was sent from Constantinople and we'll let him, make a ruling. That can appeal for that reason. Sometimes they're getting involved because they want the state to side with them for whatever reason, or they think the state will, but it's very voluntary. And you do get a strong sense that one reason why this judge was being as lenient as he was because he wanted people to come to this court, and he wanted people to accept his justice, and he couldn't really compel them to. He had a small police force. He had a jail that was intended to hold people like overnight, really. There was no real penal system. And so he's relying on people to voluntarily come to him and seek judgment. And there is a different set of judgments of people who are tribal. In particular, he makes a lot of very different rulings towards the Kurds who show up in his court than he does people who are not from tribal communities, people who are from settled communities who come before him. So no, you're quite right. You have these multiple overlapping systems of justice, and the official sort of imperial system is only one of those. And one great example. So one of the Ottoman sultans, one of the Mohammeds, then there were 50 of them, issued a ruling saying that he didn't think women should be able to negotiate their own marriages. He said it's absurd. Women shouldn't be able to betroth themselves to men, without the permission of their husband, not husband, sorry, because they're making a marriage, permission of their father. Which was something that traditionally Islamic law allowed. Adult women, they needed to consent to their marriage, and they could negotiate their own marriages. And so the Sultan says, no more doing that, and he instructs the courts all across the Ottoman Empire, if a woman comes to you to try and register a marriage, and she doesn't have a father or an older male relative there to sign off on the marriage, then it's not valid. And the empire just sort of ignores this ruling. No one follows it. He has no real ability to compel the courts, even the official imperial courts across the Ottoman Empire largely ignore this and just continue to record this woman showed up and announced that she was betrothing herself to this guy, and she was an adult, so we recorded it and we accepted it. And there's no mention of any adult male relative of hers signing off on it. And things like that happened all the time, where the Sultan would get a bee in his bonnet and would try and issue some kind of law changing how things were done, and people elsewhere would just kind of ignore them because that was not how they saw the legal system as being supposed to work. Anyway, but that's a great transition into talking about marriage and divorce. Under Islamic law, men were allowed a maximum of 4 wives, but it was rare and formally discouraged. Muhammad's statement in the Quran is, some guy asks him, can I have a second wife? And Muhammad says, yeah, you can have up to 4, but you really, this isn't ideal. If you absolutely need to do it, it's better that you add another wife than that you sleep with another woman outside of marriage. But he says only do it if you can deal justly with all your wives. And if you don't think you can deal justly once you add a second wife, then you shouldn't have more than one. And in practice, while polygamy did exist in the Muslim world, it was something for sultans. It was something for the very rich, the very powerful, simply because 52% of any given human population is women, and then 48% is men, and so there's really not a lot of wiggle room in there to have more than one wife. Right. Adult women needed to consent to marriage. They could not be married without their consent. Minors could be married without their consent by just their father, the Maliki school, or by any male legal guardian of theirs, said the Hanafis. However, they had the basis to divorce once they came of age. So a girl who was married against her, without her consent when she was young, could, once she was an adult, say, that marriage was against my consent, I'm an adult now, and sue for annulment. And we have a number of records of it happening. So it wasn't, this wasn't some kind of rare or unlikely thing. Yes, you've a question.
What was the age for consent? When did you become?
The age for... the age of adulthood,
Yes.
like how old she needed to be to consent to marriage,
Yes.
Once she has started having her period. Unlike in Judaism where we say 12, in Islam, once you hit puberty, if you're a male boy and you start having nocturnal emissions,
Which is 11 or 12.
You're an adult. Yep. If you're a girl, once you start having periods, yep. Also around at that same point, all she had to do was show like a bloody thing to the court saying, look, I've started doing this. And they said, okay, you're an adult now and you can make your own decisions about these things.
So a father could marry off his daughter who had not yet had her first period?
Yes. Yes, yes. And Dwight just mentioned Aisha, who was a wife of Muhammad, and according to the Quran, he married her when she was 6 years old. And then when he waits until she's grown up a bit, till she's turned 9, before he's intimate with her. And this is this is one of those things. You talk to some Muslims about this, and they're like, yeah, we're not really sure exactly how to deal with that one. We did talk about this in this class that I took. We talked about it, and the sort of I can't really call it a defense because it's not really a defense, is that this kind of thing was not unusual during that time period. There's a lot of anti-Muslim criticism of Muhammad from the time period. It criticizes him for having multiple wives and all kinds of things, and none of it has any real issue with their age. I hear what you're saying, and I hear what you guys are thinking. Yes, Dwight, and then Zach.
Is there a Jewish parallel?
Is there a Jewish parallel? How old do you need to be married in Judaism? I don't know. I don't know that the Torah lays out a minimum age. I don't think it states. Yes.
Not as sure about the age for women, but the age that boys were counted as adults was 13. So,
but could you be married before that? Could your parents
there could be betrothals, from what I
Yes.
recall of a similar class I took. But until the age of consent, until the age of adulthood, they could not officially be married.
Okay.
Like I said, at least in biblical times, it was 13 for the boys. Probably a similar age for the girls. Since around the time when a girl would be counted as an adult was when she had her first menses, which, as Nathan and Sarah have mentioned in a previous class, was probably closer to mid-teens than it is now.
Yes, it probably was a little later than like 11, 12.
On average, around 15 years old. Sorry, I don't have the microphone. Just because of it was probably closer to 15, just because of the lack of nutrition. Right? It's the age that girls have been getting their first periods has dropped even over the last century quite significantly, and so we know that in the medieval period it was much later than today.
It certainly doesn't look good though. In any case, yes, Zach, you had a question. Right. Please.
Yeah, two questions. One about Muhammad and his child wife.
Yes, Aisha.
Do you know if that's in the Quran or one of these
in the Quran.
hadiths?
It is not a hadith. It is explicitly in the Quran. How old she was when they married, how old she was when they became intimate. She's a major figure in Islam. She's very important because she was the youngest of his wives. She was the last surviving person to know Muhammad personally, and so towards the end of her life, she's outlived all his other wives. She's outlived his father-in-law Omar. She's outlived Abu Bakr, his son-in-law. She's outlived all these men who knew him, all these women who knew him, and so all these people are coming to her asking her questions. And a lot of the most important hadiths, the ones that are most universally recognized by Muslims, are attributed to Aisha because she knew Muhammad and she was like the last person who still remembered him personally when they were sitting down to actually write down the hadiths. And so the result is there's a lot of detail about her and a lot of information, and there's really no dispute from Muslim scholars that she was a child when they got married and that she was still a child when they consummated their marriage.
Right.
And this has been invoked. There's a couple of countries in the Middle East where the age of consent is 9 years old. And the reason why they passed those rules was people came and said, well, look, Muhammad waited until she was 9. You should set that at least as a minimum. Because before that, they had no age of consent rules at all. And,
Just to
Yes.
follow up on Aisha, how many children did she have?
None, I don't remember. I do remember that Muhammad's line dies off except for his children with his wife Fatima. So if they did have children, they didn't survive or their children died off. He had 4 children with his wife Fatima, and all the people alive today who claim descent from Muhammad claim descent from him via his wife Fatima, who was a much older wife that he had. And in fact, I can't remember if she was the one who was a divorcee before he married her or not. But what's that? Widow. No, I thought she was a divorcee. I thought he at least one of his wives was a divorced woman. That one comes up. In any case, adult women needed to consent. Minors could be married by their father. Women got to keep their property, and they had a right to maintenance. Maintenance being defined as food, clothing, and shelter, but they didn't have a right to conjugal relations. They also didn't have a right to refuse conjugal relations with their husbands. And the Islamic, the legal manuals have long things explaining what a husband is allowed to do if his wife refuses conjugal relations with him. Women could sue for divorce on various grounds. Under the Maliki school, if your husband was missing for 4 years, that was long enough, you could sue for divorce and be divorced. The Hanafi school did not accept this. They said you have to wait at least 99 years before you're allowed to do that. However, both schools allowed women to perform a kind of divorce where she would sort of pay her husband to agree to a divorce, and he would agree to it. Usually the basis of this was she gets to keep her dower. Or her dowry, he gets his dower back. The payment that he brought into the marriage, he gets that back, and then he agrees to divorce her. There's also, they could also sue for divorce on a couple of other limited grounds, including his inability to consummate the marriage at all. But this contrasts to men being able to divorce at will. On the one hand, and I do think there's a point there, one point in the favor of Islamic law is that women could, they could keep their property, that's a point, and they could get divorced even if their husbands didn't want it on a number of grounds, including his failure to provide maintenance. And I think we all know the issue with chained women that we have in Judaism. But men could divorce at will, and I think that's really a point in our favor. Because while women can't get a divorce in Judaism unless their husband consents, men it's really, really hard for a man to divorce his wife in Judaism unless his wife consents. He needs like 99 rabbis to sign off on it, and they're not going to do that if he's trying to say divorce his wife because he doesn't want to pay her medical bills. And that's not an issue in Islam. Have any of you guys heard of Ibn Battuta? You've heard of Ibn Battuta? Anyone remember who he was? The name sounds familiar. He was a Moroccan legal scholar, a Muslim religious judge, and a traveler. He writes this book about his travels. He goes down to Mali, he goes to Mecca, he travels all the way to China, he comes back, he goes to Constantinople, all these places, writes about it. And we know that according to him in his own book, when he's in the Maldives, he marries a couple of women, and then he's ready to leave the Maldives and move on, and he doesn't want to bring them with him, and one of them's pregnant, and he doesn't want to deal with that, and so he just divorces both of them and moves on. And they don't have any recourse to that. All right. Any other questions here, guys? No? The image up here, by the way, that's Muhammad. That's his daughter, and that's the guy she married. I'm forgetting which one. Anyway. All right, so having looked at all of this, is Islamic law harsher to women than Jewish law? Yeah, I think it is, to a degree. I think there is that there. Is it as harsh as some of these extreme cases we talked about at the beginning merit? Okay. Anyone want to share their just comments and opinions, about answering this question here? Please.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole issue in terms of caring about women. I mean, the issue about a right to conjugal relations that women have in Judaism, as opposed to
That does certainly feel like
not being able to say no when you're 9 years old. I can't. I'm going to have a very hard time getting over that today. I just.
Yeah.
How old was Muhammad at the time?
I don't know, but certainly he was a fully adult man. Like this is, I will say that would not have been, his relationship with her would not have been considered abnormal at the time. Powerful men using positions of power and influence to marry, or not even marry, just have intercourse with girls was not considered strange in that part of the world at that point in time. That's not an excuse. We're not saying this is okay. We're not giving him a pass on that. Just like these Christian commentators write these whole long books condemning Muhammad for having multiple wives, and none of them say anything at all about him marrying women, having a wife who's 9, because none of them saw it as wrong. But like the pre-modern world was a really not a great time to be alive and be a woman or a girl. But no, I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right.
This idea that children are past infancy are essentially tiny adults, and they're really treated as such really from the time that they're able to do anything on their own. And that's true across the Middle East and Europe and a lot of places in the world.
There is sometimes people will ask me, you're a history teacher, they'll say, what time period in history would you like to live in? And the answer is always, how close to the present am I allowed to live? Because the reality is, for all the issues we may have with our modern society, it is a better time to be alive than really any other time in history. I wouldn't, I guess maybe the 90s were better than today, but I certainly, there is no really time in the past that was better than the present. Anyone else wanna chime in or answer questions? Yeah, Simone.
Thank you. One little comment about Jewish law. It's also the community law and customs and traditions that are so often more binding than official law. And women had to submit to what their community laws were.
That's true.
And by the way, for arranged marriages, in fact, there was a lady in Sacramento. She's buried in a cemetery. You'll see her name, Casoto. She came from a Turkish family. Her marriage was arranged when she must have been 2 years old. And she was sent to live with her husband's family, which was very common in the Middle East, to be familiar with the customs of your husband's family.
Yeah.
Only he happened to die young, and so she was considered bad luck. And that was
She was ruined.
But it was the positive that happened to her. So she was sent to live with relatives in France and married a French Jew.
That's good.
Ended up in the United States, in Israel, wherever, and lived a more open life. So, but living in Syria, I knew of quite a few arranged marriages for children.
No, absolutely. Yeah, Zach.
It's not on this question exactly, but
Sure.
I just two questions. One, so it sounds like polygamy persisted in the Islamic world much later than in the Jewish world or the Christian world. Maybe?
Much later than the Christian world, hard to say the Jewish world, because Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in the Middle East were continuing to have polygamous marriages up until the state of Israel. Israeli marriage law does not allow you to conduct polygamous marriages anymore in Israel, but it does recognize the legality of polygamous marriages conducted in countries outside of Israel, because you had all these Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews moving to Israel, and some of them had more than one wife. It wasn't very common, and it was very rare to have more than two, but it absolutely happened. But it did last longer in the Islamic world, and the movement away from polygamy was a big part of. The European countries level a whole bunch of criticism at the Muslim world in the 1800s and the 1900s, and a lot of it starts to land. And you have a lot of Muslim thinkers and commentators saying, well, maybe the Europeans are right about this stuff, because clearly, we're being colonized and we're being conquered, and clearly the Muslim world is not, at its anywhere near its former glory. Maybe we should make some of these changes. And some of the things they start doing is they start saying, well, maybe we should move away from polygamy. Maybe we should have an age of consent. Maybe we should ban the veil and the headscarf and require that everyone wear European clothing, which is what happens in Iran and Turkey. And they start doing these things. Yeah.
And I was curious about, maybe this is not really the exact form for this, but in Jewish tradition, I guess there's a division between there's two parts of a wedding, right? There's like this, that are now combined into one.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if that is common in the Islamic world, if that was a tradition that also shows up there.
Yeah, we combine the betrothal with the wedding. We don't do long betrothals anymore. My understanding is that, obviously it depends what part of the Islamic world you're living in, but that they have moved away from betrothals to some degree. I don't know that they're required to do a betrothal before they can do a wedding. They might have just dropped it entirely in some cases. But they had a similar tradition to us, which is you have a betrothal prior to a marriage, and it lasts for a certain amount of time, and then the two are married. I see the rabbi wants to say something.
Oh, good. And sorry, I'm late. I had some things for my conversion students, and today was the only day I could do it. My question, my comment on that, and I might have missed this. I don't know if in Islam there's the same type of thing as an aguna, because that's why there. Yeah.
We mentioned this. They don't have aguna. Women have it's harder for women to divorce than it is for men, but they can divorce husbands even if the husband doesn't want them to. And they have a basis for going to a religious court and getting a marriage annulled, sometimes against their husband's will. So they don't have that, and that is a point in their favor. All right, I want to just address this and say I think there's a case to be made that Jewish law is overall better than women, that in some areas maybe Muslim women have it better, and in some areas maybe Jewish women have it better. You can argue that overall it's better, but I don't know that you can make the case that Islamic law is inherently worse than other legal systems from like the Middle Ages and the pre-modern period. I think it was roughly typical about that time, and I think it even has some advantages over some of the older pagan legal systems that it replaced. So the question then becomes, What happened?
In the 21st century.
What happened? Why did, how do we go from Islamic law, which is by modern standards has a lot of major problems, but how do we go from that to cases like those we talked about in the very beginning, where, let's see, how do we get from that to cases like Zafra and Bibi and Bari and Magaza? Because what they're doing is they're combining, Hanafi law would not have considered a woman being pregnant outside of wedlock as evidence of fornication. And Maliki law does, but Maliki law would have absolutely taken a woman's word for it. If she came and said, I was raped, they would have said, okay, that's enough probable doubt to not punish you for this. Certainly enough a doubt not to sentence you to death for this. And then they would have charged the men she accused with a property crime. That one that probably would have ended with them facing corporal punishment. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the answer is you have to take it in context.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you look at why Islam, which in the Arab world, for instance, we know that the center of poetry and mathematics and science, with the Christian world was nowhere.
Yeah.
And then it flips.
Mm-hmm.
And so the common historical answer is the Protestant Reformation allows for a questioning, or it forces a questioning of Christianity, where what we see, particularly as we get to the later 19th century, and then skipping a century into later 20th century with the rise of, for instance, the Taliban. We'll just use them as an example. That questioning, internal dissent and questioning becomes a matter of heresy. And that is, it's a bigger sin than anything. So that it concentrates power on those who want to accumulate power. And women are seen by those who want to exercise power as a threat. And as a result, the laws become more oppressive. But there is a contrary trend. I mean, for instance, so in Saudi Arabia, up until the 1990s, as women couldn't drive. And now the role of women has changed dramatically as that society has changed. However, again, it's not out of context, because in terms of the hereditary line, we have people who are taking a very different approach to governance. And so it doesn't lead the conversation, it follows the conversation.
Gosh, you say some very interesting things, and I'm debating which ones I want to address first. The first thing I'll address is you're absolutely right, and one thing I was going to mention was that there is another trend in the Islamic world. The case of Zafra and Bibi, she becomes a cause célèbre, and there's a big push by women in Pakistan to revise the laws in Pakistan, and they succeed. They succeed. There is still Islamic law still plays a major role in Pakistan. Fornication and adultery are still seen as crimes, but they lay out laws to punish rapists, actually, and to make sure that women don't get punished for trying to come and make reports of that. And so that there is a movement in a positive direction, really, in all these places. I've heard the theory that it was the Protestant Reformation that results in the Christian world going one way and the Islamic world going another. It's definitely true they went in different directions. I'm not sure that I accept the argument that it was Protestantism that did it. The big thing that Protestantism does to change Europe is they argue that you need to translate the Christian Bible into the common languages, and that everyone needs to learn to read and write so that everyone can read the Bible. But Islam already had most of that. They might not have been translating the Quran outside of Arabic much, but much of the Islamic world is already just speaking Arabic as their common day language, and they had a push, going back to the Middle Ages, for ordinary men and women to learn the basics of Islamic law and to be able to read the Quran. So Well, things definitely ended up in a different way. I'm not sure that it was the Protestant Reformation that did it. Certainly, something did it. There's something that happens there that they go off in another direction. I want to go back to something you said, and something you said at the very beginning of all of this, where you guys touched on, and you especially, Jonathan, brought up the fact that it seemed like these were leaders trying to signal that they were being authentic, that they're being strong, that they see their customs and traditions as being under attack, and so they're trying to assert, push against that. And that really is, I think, what a lot of it comes down to. When Britain invaded Egypt, they justified their invasion of Egypt in part on the need to protect Muslim women in Egypt and to free them from oppression under these Muslim systems which were so oppressive towards them. When the French went into Syria, they make the same kind of argument. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, one of the arguments they make is that they are liberating women and making them equal, or at least they're helping to defend a socialist government that is freeing these women and making them equal. I'm sure we all remember when the United States went into Afghanistan, that one of the arguments that was used was, we're going into Afghanistan in part to free these women from the rule of the Taliban. And regardless of how genuine or not genuine these arguments were, the experience in a lot of the Muslim world has been that arguments in favor of the liberation of women are foreign. They are European. They are Christian. They are the arguments being used by people invading. And so for a lot of Muslims, not all of them by any means, but for a good chunk of Muslims, arguments in favor of women's rights are seen as automatically suspect, and arguments in favor of restricting them are seen as more authentic, more native. If it draws condemnation, if the West is like, that is a horrible thing you've done, that's just more points in its favor. That's just another demonstration of how real and authentic it is. And so what you get is these attempts to go to the most extreme possible interpretation of Islamic law, mixing and matching elements of Hanafi and Maliki law that were never applied together, to try and get really the worst possible outcome as a way for leaders in the Muslim world to say, look, we're defending Islam, we're defending its traditions, we're standing up to foreignness and to these external influences. I see your hand. I'll call on you in a moment, Mr. Weisberg. You guys, the Shah of Iran, I'm sure we've all seen pictures of Iran before the Islamic Revolution, all these women dressed in like Western clothing. Under the Shah, women were required to dress that way. It was illegal for women to wear headscarves or veils. Now, I think the Islamic Republic's decision to require that all women must dress a certain way is probably more impressive than what the Shah was doing, but it is a reaction to the Shah saying you must dress a certain way and justifying his authoritarianism on the grounds that he was protecting women. And I think a lot of it comes down really to that. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel compelled to say that my observation of the Jewish world, the religious Jewish world, though, has definite aspects of what you're describing. What I have seen, just reading, Jewish press and things, is that within the Orthodox world, there seems to be a division where definitely Batei Dinim are reacting very suspiciously to notions of modernity and the equality that comes from modernity. Other parts of the Orthodox world are more interested in trying to listen to these things and adapt to them. So I just want to say that before we say, well, Jewish law and its interpretation is superior to Islamic, I would be very cautious saying that, because I think there's a definite part of the world Jewish community, forgive me, I don't know if I want to go as far as within the Haredim world, the Haredi world, I don't see any progress. And I see a definite reactionary response to efforts to change some of these things.
I think there is certainly, I hear what you're saying. I think there is definitely a reactionary response among certain strains of Jewish and indeed in certain strains of Christian thought that's quite similar, that sees themselves and their way of thinking and their way of life as under attack, and so responds by trying to go towards extremes in the other direction, including being oppressive towards women. I'm sure we've all heard of the modesty patrols. The modesty patrols in certain ultra-Orthodox parts of Israel, certain Haredi parts of Israel, where men will go around and harass women. Oh, you okay? Where men will go around and harass women they think aren't dressed modestly enough. That is certainly something that happens there. Yes, absolutely, to the extent of condemning to death. This isn't a case of women's law, but I'm reminded of a fellow who attacked a pride parade in Tel Aviv, attempting to kill participants. It's very clear that the rabbis made it clear, if you want to sentence someone to death for homosexuality, even assuming you accept those laws the way they accept them, you would need 2 adult male witnesses testifying before a Beit Din who actually saw the act and cited to the person, this is the law and you'll be put to death for this. And, so what this guy was doing was in no way a reflection of even like the strictest sort of medieval Jewish law. But he was trying to do it anyway because because he's part of this same sort of reactionary response. And we only have one Jewish state, and we don't have like the Muslim world, you've got all these different Muslim governments, many of which apply Islamic law in varying degrees. We only have one Jewish state, and it applies Jewish law in some fairly limited circumstances, marriage in particular. And men who won't divorce their wives in Israel can be put in jail until they agree to do so. So we don't have these kind of examples, but one could certainly, imagine in a hypothetical sense, if the folks in Mea Shearim were allowed their own country, what they would try and do there. Yes, Rabbi.
I just want to add that okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't get to make my point earlier, but on this, he'd be considered, those people would be considered a rodef. It goes back to the Yitzhak Rabin era, and I don't think it's just in the Haredi world. I think in the very strong Messianic Zionist world in general, which is not the Haredi world, if someone is considered a rodef, one you need to pursue and get in order to, because they're such a perversion of the world that should be. And I don't view Yitzhak Rabin that way, but that's the most famous example. That's not the only example of this, however. And so there is that danger, and that I wouldn't even call it an undercurrent anymore. It's mainstream in a lot of the Jewish world in Israel, especially.
It's a shame. It really is. Are there any other questions or comments? I'm done with my presentation. Okay. Thank you, guys. We're going to do, let's see, I will hang around and I will happily answer any other questions people may have. We have a question right here. Shall we?
We have one more announcement.
One more announcement. All right. Yes, please.
So, today is Nathan's birthday, and if you all would, and Sarah's is pretty soon too.
Tomorrow.
Okay. Oh, tomorrow. Well, early happy birthday, Sarah. So, here we go. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Ethan and Sarah. Happy birthday to you. That's mailed.
Thank you, guys. We will be doing more talks in the future. We wanted to do a theme on, what was it? Like, It was like change in Judaism. Yeah, so we'll be doing a series of additional talks. We're going to focus a bit more on Judaism in these future talks than this one did. When's our next one, Sarah?
At the end of the month.
End of the month? What day? I don't remember exactly.
No, I think it got moved.
Did it get moved? Oh,
It got moved because June 28th is.
July 12th is what we have.
July 12th?
okay.
We can't do that.
We're going to be okay. There will be more lectures. We will figure out exactly when. Keep an eye on your email. You'll get an email when precise times and dates are announced. Thank you guys so much for coming, and I'll be around if anyone wants to ask me any questions.
Thank you. That was terrific.
You might have mentioned already, but the reason we don't do the Erusin followed by Nisuin is the Aguna issue. Someone could disappear. But yeah, I'm sorry I missed the beginning. I'd love to see the recording. Sure.